My grandmother's house on Cartier Street had a back porch that faced west, and every August evening when I was a child, she would bring out 2 mugs of red rose tea, and we would sit there until the sky went completely dark. She always used the same mugs, white with a thin blue rim, slightly chipped on one side from the time my cousin knocked the cabinet door open too fast. She never replaced them. She said things that still worked didn't need to be fixed. Grandma passed on a Thursday in late October. The hospice nurse called me at 6:14 inches the morning, and I remember looking out my apartment window at the first frost on the rooftops and thinking that she would have said something quiet and sensible about the timing. Something like, well, at least the garden's already done for the season. My sister arrived at the house on Cartier Street that same afternoon. I had been there since 8 a.m., letting in the funeral home coordinator, signing the initial paperwork, calling the list of relatives that my grandmother had kept in a small notebook in her kitchen drawer organized alphabetically, with little notes beside each name like hard of hearing, speak up and prefers to be called by middle name. My grandmother was a woman who thought ahead. My sister walked in around 2 o'clock, dropped her coat on the bench by the door, looked around the living room and said, "Has anyone called a real estate agent yet?" I want to be precise about this because I think it matters. Our grandmother had been gone for roughly 8 hours. The hospice coordinator was still in the kitchen, finishing her notes, and my sister's first question was about the property value. I said we weren't doing that today. She said she was just asking. I went back to the kitchen. My sister is 3 years younger than me. We are not close in the way that some sisters are close, but we have always been functional, which is its own kind of thing. We grew up in the same house in Oakville, went to different universities, landed in different cities. She moved to Calgary for a relationship that lasted 18 months, and then stayed there for the next 6 years, working in sales, cycling through apartments, accumulating a kind of restless energy that always made me feel slightly tired when I was around her. She called our grandmother on holidays. She visited once a year, sometimes twice. She remembered birthdays. She was not a bad person. Exactly. She was just someone who looked at a room and immediately calculated what things were worth. Our grandmother had 2 significant assets: the house on Cartier Street, which she had owned outright since our grandfather died in 2009, and a registered savings account at TD Bank that she had been quietly building for decades. She was not a wealthy woman by any standard definition, but she had been careful her entire life in the way that people of her generation were careful. No debt, no waste, no spending on things that couldn't be justified. The house was appraised at around $480,000 the last time it came up, which in the Hamilton area is modest but real. The savings account, I would learn later, held just under $94,000. I knew about the will because my grandmother had told me about it herself, about 2 years before she died. We were sitting on the back porch, same as always, and she said she wanted me to know what she had decided so that there were no surprises. She had divided things clearly. The savings account was to be split equally between my sister and me. The house was to go to me, with the condition that I give my sister the option to purchase my half at fair market value if I ever decided to sell within 10 years. It was a careful, considered arrangement. Very her. She had also told me something else on that porch, in a quieter voice. She said she had already spoken to her lawyer about making sure the documents were properly structured, because she knew my sister had gone through some financial difficulties in the last few years, and she didn't want there to be any confusion about what was meant and what was not meant. I nodded and didn't ask for details, because it felt like the right thing to do. I found out the details later. In the first week after the funeral, there was too much to do for anything else to surface. I handled the death certificates, the notifications to Service Canada, the cancellation of her provincial health card, the calls to her bank, the sorting of her mail. My sister flew in from Calgary for the service and stayed 4 days. She was composed at the funeral, appropriate with relatives, helpful in a surface way. She made sandwiches. She accepted casseroles at the door. She kept her phone face down on the counter, which I noticed because it was unusual for her. We did not talk about the estate in any real way while she was there. She flew back to Calgary on the Sunday. The following Tuesday, I got a call from my grandmother's lawyer, a woman named Darlene who had been handling her affairs for about 15 years. Darlene was efficient and warm in equal measure, the kind of person who could deliver complicated information without making you feel either patronized or overwhelmed. She said she had been in touch with TD Bank to begin the estate process, and that something had come up that I should know about. I sat down at my kitchen table. She told me that 3 weeks before my grandmother died, during a period when my grandmother was still technically lucid but was declining in ways that were documented, my sister had driven from Calgary to Hamilton. No one had known she was coming. She had stayed 2 nights. During that visit, She had accompanied my grandmother to a TD branch and had my grandmother sign updated paperwork on the savings account, adding my sister as a joint account holder with right of survivorship. What that means, in practical terms, is that when my grandmother died, the $94,000 in that account did not become part of the estate. It passed directly and automatically to my sister, outside the will entirely. Darlene said it in a measured, careful way. She said there were questions about capacity and undue influence that would be worth examining. She said she had already flagged the matter with a colleague who handled these situations. I said, "When did she do this? What date?" Darlene told me, "It was 11 days before the palliative care team had noted a significant cognitive decline in my grandmother's records. It was 14 days before she had stopped being able to reliably recall the names of people who visited." I sat at my kitchen table for a while after I hung up. I should explain something about my professional background because it becomes relevant. I work as a paralegal at a firm in Hamilton that handles primarily estate and family law matters. I have been doing this for 6 years. I am not a lawyer, but I understand the process. I understand the documents, and I understand what certain patterns tend to mean when you see them in this context. When Darlene described what had happened, I was not confused about what I was hearing. I understood it very precisely. What I felt, sitting at that table, was something harder to name. It was not entirely surprise, and it was not entirely grief, and it was not entirely anger, though it had something of all three. It was more like the particular hollowness that comes when something you hoped was not true turns out to be exactly what you feared. I called my sister that evening. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting the call. I told her I had spoken with Darlene. I told her I knew about the account change. I did not say anything else for a moment, and neither did she. The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then she said it had been Grandma's idea. She said Grandma had been worried about the estate process taking too long and had wanted to make sure things were accessible. She said she was just helping. I said Grandma had a lawyer she trusted for 15 years if she had concerns about the estate process. My sister said I was making it into something it wasn't. I said I would be in touch. I want to be honest about the next several weeks because I think the honest version is more useful than a clean one. I was not strategic and composed from the beginning. I went through a period of being genuinely angry in a way that made it hard to sleep. Not just about the money, but about the image of my grandmother in a bank branch, declining, being guided through paperwork she may not have fully understood. And I think that is the part that I still find difficult to sit with cleanly. The money is a number. The other thing is harder. I spoke with a lawyer at my firm, a senior partner named Paul, who had handled capacity-related estate challenges before. He listened to the full account and asked careful questions about the timeline, the medical records, the documentation at the branch. He was calm in the way that experienced people are calm, which was what I needed. He said there were grounds to challenge the account change on the basis of undue influence and potentially questionable capacity, given the timeline relative to the documented decline. He said it was not a certain outcome, but it was a legitimate and arguable case. He also said I should gather everything I could while it was still accessible. I requested my grandmother's medical records from the palliative care team. I contacted the 2 neighbors who had been in regular contact with her in her final month and asked if they would be willing to speak with a lawyer about what they had observed. I went back through my own calendar and wrote down every visit, every phone call, every specific thing my grandmother had said to me in the last 6 months of her life that was relevant to her intentions. I had the conversation on the back porch in my notes from the week it happened because I had written it down that same night in the journal I keep sporadically but have kept long enough that it functions as a record. I also contacted TD Bank directly because as someone who works in estate law, I knew what to ask for and how to ask for it. I requested the branch visit records and flagged the account change as a matter under dispute, which put a formal notation on the account. My sister called me twice during this period. The first time I let it go to voicemail. She left a message saying she thought we should talk and that she hoped we weren't going to make this into a legal thing because Grandma would have hated that. The second time I answered and told her, as plainly as I could, that I had retained a lawyer and that any further communication should go through him. She said I was being dramatic. I said I would have Paul's contact information sent to her by end of day. The formal challenge took about 4 months to work through. I won't walk through every step because it was procedurally dense and not all of it is mine to share in detail. What I will say is that the combination of the documented cognitive timeline, the medical records, the branch records, which showed that my sister had been the primary person speaking with the bank representative during the visit, and 2 written statements from neighbors who had noticed changes in my grandmother's comprehension in the weeks prior, all of it together formed a picture that Paul described as compelling. My sister's lawyer attempted to argue that the account change was consistent with my grandmother's expressed wishes and that the timing, while unfortunate, did not constitute undue influence. They submitted a statement from my sister describing several conversations in which our grandmother had apparently expressed concern about the estate process. What they did not have, and what we did have, was a dated note in my grandmother's own handwriting, found in the same kitchen drawer as her phone list. It was not a formal document. It was written on the back of an envelope, in the slightly uneven print of someone whose hands were not entirely steady. It said, and I will quote it here because it is not long, "The account at TD is for both girls, equal. Darlene knows what I want. Trust Darlene." It was dated 6 weeks before my sister's unannounced visit. Paul submitted it as part of the evidentiary record. He said, afterward, that it was the clearest single piece of the case. The matter was resolved through a negotiated settlement rather than going to full litigation, which Paul said was the most practical outcome given the costs and timeline of a court proceeding. My sister agreed to return the $94,000 to the estate, which was then distributed according to the will, $47,000 each. The legal fees came out of my share in part, which stung, but Paul had warned me about that going in, and I had decided it was worth it regardless. My sister did not reach out to me personally during the settlement process. Her lawyer communicated with Paul. When everything was finalized, I received a single text from her that said, "I hope you're happy." I did not respond. I have thought about whether I should have responded or what I would have said if I had. I don't have a clean answer. I am not happy, exactly, in the way the text implied some triumphant satisfaction at having won. What I feel is closer to a kind of exhausted clarity. I did what needed to be done. I did it for the right reasons, and I did it as carefully as I could. And at the end of it, the outcome reflected what my grandmother actually wanted. That is not nothing. The house on Cartier Street is mine now. I have not moved into it. I'm still in my apartment, still figuring out the longer-term plan. But I've spent several weekends there, cleaning, sorting, deciding what to keep. The back porch still faces west. In the spring, I found the 2 mugs in the cabinet, white with the thin blue rim, still chipped on one side. I washed them and put them back exactly where they were. What I didn't expect, in the months after all of this, was not the anger or the grief or the legal process. Those I had prepared for, in one way or another. What I didn't prepare for was the specific kind of sadness that comes from knowing that the last weeks of someone's life were used against them. That someone sat with her, maybe held her hand, maybe made her tea, and also guided a pen across paperwork. I don't know exactly what happened in that branch. I don't know how much she understood. I hope it was more than I sometimes fear. What I do know is what she wrote on the back of that envelope. I know she trusted Darlene. I know she sat on that porch with me and told me her intentions clearly, in her own words, on an August evening when the sky was taking a long time to go dark. Those mugs still work. She was right about that. If you've been through something like this with your own family, or if you're watching a parent or grandparent get older and you're not sure what steps to take, please talk to an estate lawyer before you need one. My grandmother did everything right. She had a will, she had a lawyer, she had a plan. The challenge came from a direction she hadn't entirely anticipated. Getting things documented and understood early is the kindest thing you can do for the people who will be left sorting through it. I learned that watching her, and I learned it again this year in a harder way. Take care of each other. And if something doesn't feel right, trust that. Write it down. Keep the records. You may need them someday, and you will be glad you have them.